It's time for that fifth lab in our series, Science and Wine. And I have a feeling most of you are very excited for this, because how often do you get to talk about wine on a dry campus? So let's talk a little bit about wine. Wine has been made for at least the last 7,000 years, according to your text. The earliest I could find was 6,000 BC. So we're talking 8,000 years ago, all the way back in Georgia. There have been signs, there have been archaeological discoveries that wine was being made back in 6,000 BC. Now, why would people have made wine? Well, because it was safer than drinking the water. The reason you don't drink water in Mexico is because it's not publicly treated or safe. Well, back then there was no water treatment either, and you couldn't tell if your water was polluted or not. But if you had wine, the alcohol content in the wine caused it to be, caused the water to not be able to support the growth of any bacteria or much bacteria, and therefore it was safer. So whether it was made 6,000 years or 8,000 years ago, or if it's made today, wine is made much the same way. The way that wine is made is that we ferment grapes, meaning we take grapes and we mash them down into a mash. That's what this is. And once the grapes are mashed down, they produce this juice that we allow to sit, and over time will become alcoholic. But how does it become alcoholic? Well, let's talk about the sugars in the grapes, because grapes have a large concentration of sugar. The sugars in grapes come from the grapes being a plant, and plants photosynthesize their own food. They make their own food out of sunlight. And photosynthesis is the opposite of respiration. So while you breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, plants through photosynthesis take in carbon dioxide and put out oxygen and sugar. So when I say everything breathes to carry out respiration, I'm not talking about you breathe in, breathe out. You're breathing in oxygen because oxygen is used by your cells to create energy. So photosynthesis takes light in and converts carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen. You take in oxygen and sugar, you eat things, and you produce carbon dioxide and water, as well as energy in some form, in a form that we call ATP, which is a stored chemical energy. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, releases large amounts of energy, massive amounts of energy, whenever the phosphorus groups are broken off of it. If you want a picture. Isn't that a nice picture of that? The reason I zoom in on adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is because this magical little compound, this magical miracle of a molecule, powers everything in your cells, everything your cells do, from your simplest from your muscle contractions to the powering of your heart to keeping your brain functioning, is all powered through ATP. Now there are two ways to break the phosphorus off of ATP. You can go one route where you use oxygen, which is what you're doing right now as you sit and listen to my overtly boring lesson that started so cool with wine. You breathe in oxygen, you take oxygen in, and through a chemical process that you're not required to know, it breaks down it breaks down sugar to produce ATP. That's aerobic respiration. If oxygen's not present, you can still produce some ATP from sugar going through an anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration produces oxygen, carbon dioxide, and ATP. Produces carbon dioxide and water and ATP. Anaerobic respiration produces a little bit of ATP, water, and some byproduct, which is usually waste. Now back to the question at hand. How do grapes make alcohol? Well, grapes don't necessarily make alcohol. It's actually the yeast on their skin. Yeast is a fungus, a single-celled fungus, that undergoes only aerobic respiration. They don't do any sort of cellular respiration using oxygen. They only undergo anaerobic respiration to produce their ATP. And when they do this, they produce ATP for themselves, and as a byproduct will produce ethanol, which is alcohol that you can ingest. If you're ever on Jeopardy, I included this graphic because I liked it because it pointed out one thing. If you're ever on Jeopardy, you also actually can undergo anaerobic respiration. Whenever you're working out at the gym or you're working really hard and you start breathing very heavily, you're depleting your oxygen reserves in your body. And your cells have to undergo anaerobic respiration, and the byproduct they produce is lactic acid. So if your muscles ever feel sore, that's a lactic acid buildup in your muscles that actually protects them. But back to the situation at hand, ethanol. The ethanol produced by yeast is what we trap, and that's the alcohol that is ingestible by us being mammals. So fermentation, the conversion of sugar in the grape mash into alcohol, can be upset by any number of factors, and that can be the difference between a good wine and a really awful bottle of wine. And these factors can be anything from temperature, meaning you can speed up how fast those yeast cells produce alcohol, or you can slow them down if you freeze them. But if you speed them up too fast, you might boil them and kill them, and then you're not going to produce any alcohol, and you have really awful wine. So that's something bad. pH can change your how good your wine is. Yeast cells have a relatively low tolerance for a change in pH. So if your grape mash is too acidic or it's too basic, they're not going to produce nearly as much alcohol as you would like, and that's going to change the taste of your wine. The type of yeast. Some yeasts produce a lot of alcohol, some produce very little. Some have a very bitter taste, some have a very sweet taste. And same with grapes. Some have good tastes, some have different tastes. Depends on what you like. I'm more of a white myself. I like white wines. But the reason it's white has nothing to do with the grapes.